Hi, everyone. This is the lecture for week 10. Today, we're talking about conspiracy panics and alternative facts. I added a couple things that were not originally in the syllabus, but they are optional. So I'll go through them at the end a little bit, but also feel free to just skim those. I just thought that maybe thinking a little bit about how this applies to some of the structures of role play and gaming that we've already talked about in previous weeks might be interesting for you guys. So your first reading is from Jack Bradish, who is a professor here in the Journalism and Media Studies program at SCI, the School of Communication and Information. And he's the author of Conspiracy Panics, Political Rationality and Popular Culture, and On Microfascisms. Hopefully, this should be an interesting week. We're going to talk about Jack's work, about what's at play in not just conspiracies, but the way that we talk about conspiracies and the way that we experience crisis about the existence of conspiracy theories impacts. So the first thing Jack really reading his conclusion. So when I say first, I mean kind of what he's doing in this book chapter is summarizing what he's talked about in the rest of the book, Conspiracy Panics. And so he starts with a real understanding of what conspiracy theory is, which is a hard thing to define. And he gives a lot of historical examples in part because it is so hard to define. So he gives case studies of known conspiracy theories that circulate a lot. And a lot of these also, I think it should be noted for our class in particular, circulate a lot in particular through social media, right? Through the existence of the internet. So some of the first things that appeared on the internet were conspiracy theory groups. And that's true of every platform. So whether we're talking about the emergence of Twitter or Reddit, 4chan, these spaces always end up having corners that are pretty devoted to these kinds of thoughts. And we see them. So he talks about the JFK assassination conspiracy theory, which stated that Lee Harvey Oswald, who was the person who was arrested and tried for the murder of JFK, could not possibly have done it, that there needed to be multiple shooters. There are films about this, which brings us to a kind of an interesting point of what will come up in our second reading. The conspiracy theories are always thought of as like alt and separate from the majority thought. But there are films that are based on this conspiracy theory, right? There are like major Hollywood films. So it's not so other for us, right? There are a lot of ways the conspiracy models of thinking and specific conspiracy theories end up being part of dominant culture. So there was, in fact, actually an official report that was put together. It was 888-page report that was put together by the Warren Commission and established by LBJ, the president who succeeded JFK, so Lyndon Johnson. And their determination was that, in fact, Lee Harvey Oswald had been acting alone as a skilled marksman and an ex-Marine. But there are a lot of other alternative theories, right? So the people who didn't believe the Warren Commission results came up with a whole lot of these other alternative theories, and they've been floating around for the last 60 years now. So these included everything from communist plots to Lyndon Johnson himself being the person who had orchestrated the murder in order to gain power. People said it was the mob that he owed money to. People brought up the fact that his family had been essentially, quote unquote, like new money, right? They were Irish and he was the first and to this date still only Catholic president. And their family had gained the majority of their wealth through bootlegging during Prohibition. And so there were a lot of suspicions that he was tied perpetually to the mob. People talked about this in relationship to Marilyn Monroe. There's a lot of stuff. And these are largely, we'll talk about this more, ways that people were navigating conversations that are actually about much bigger social norms than they are just about the specific instance, right? And this is one of the things that comes up in the way we talk about conspiracies and conspiracy theories. And another example, of course, that he gives is that the moon landing was a conspiracy that never happened, that NASA had spent all of this money on a sound stage production in order to trick the American public and to trick the world, in part because of there's a number of logics as to why they say this would have happened, right? That this was part of the Cold War battle with Russia or the USSR at that time, or that there were other factors involved that were about, if you get into the people who go all the way into the quote unquote flat earthers, right, who don't believe that the globe is round, who believe that everything is this fiction constructed by people in power, and that it's all kind of some trickery to take us away from other kinds of belief systems. But yeah, so this claims, right, that not only were we not on the moon in the initial 1969 landing, but that also no subsequent or previous missions to space have actually been real, that all of these things are fictions that are created to divert attention. So the actual information here is that in 1969, Apollo 11 did in fact land on the moon. Those theories came up really quickly right afterwards, and the stories generally claim that the film crew built it, which is what we just talked about as part of Cold War American propaganda against the Soviet Union. And here's one of the things that attempt to refute this, like how is it that somebody can be on the moon and the shadows are going in opposite directions? And right, it's an attempt to explain how that actually works. Physicists have tried to explain this. Lots of people have tried to dispel these really rampant conspiracy theories that still circulate. So, one of the most prevalent conspiracy theories is one that started immediately after 9/11, like on the day. And of course, this was a much more recent case, 20 years ago now, right? A little bit more. And I remember that this conspiracy appeared literally the same day or the next day. It was immediate. And there were a lot of people who suggested different reasons as to why. And Jack goes through some of the different conspiracy theories that arose around this. So the kind of let it, quote unquote, let it happen on purpose. In other words, the government knew it was coming and didn't do anything to stop it, or they made it happen on purpose. The sort of model that, like, in fact, actually, the government bombed the buildings themselves and then staged the whole thing to make it look like it was planes that were crashing into it. And there are really elaborate stories about this. Um, and then there's the sort of more general, the official account is just wrong. But he explains all of these things and the ways that people are talking about what the underlying plots might be for why this would happen. So, along with these different narratives of conspiracy models that are out there, conspiracy stories that have existed for a while and gained a lot of public visibility. And like I said, when we were talking about the JFK story and the Scorsese film about it, even a kind of legitimacy, right? He also talks, though, about how the term conspiracy theory has within it a kind of negative perception, obviously built into it. So he says that it's a bridge term, so it links the subjugating conceptual strategies to narratives that investigate conspiracies. What that means, linking negative perceptions and dismissive attitudes, that's what subjugating strategies are, toward conspiracy theories with narratives of the theories. So this duality highlights the complex nature of how conspiracy theories are perceived and engaged with in society, right? As both something that people tend to gravitate toward in many ways, right? And especially among populisms, which he talks about too, and are also like critical of at the same time. So in the concluding chapter that I actually gave you guys to read, he's really talking a lot more about the mode of the conspiracy panic, right? So I gave you guys a lot of background on what kinds of conspiracy theories are informing the way he's thinking about conspiracy panics. But the concluding chapter that you actually had to read is really about the panics themselves. And so I just want to give you guys a little bit of background on the framework of a moral panic, which is what he's drawing on here. So the original frame of the moral panic came first from a man named Stanley Cohen. And what he's writing about is a subculture of mods and rockers who were like punk and rockabilly subcultures in the like mid 20th century, in the late 50s, early 60s. And he argued that they were perceived as these really like these sort of monsters. They call them folk devils, right? He's connecting them to other kinds of like histories about the way people perceive different groups of people. And in this case, it's the young, right? It's like the young in a different kind of cultural subgroup that's framed as threatening to the dominant culture. And so is therefore seen as deviant and not socially acceptable, right? And that the response from the dominant culture is what he calls the moral panic. And this is the kind of, oh my God, these kids are out of control. They're out of line. They're going to cause all these problems. The world is melting down because of these kids. And that is something that gets spun a lot through media discourse. And it produces a lot of other effects. There's another follow-up text, and we've talked a little bit in this class already about Stuart Hall and his really important work in cultural studies. And so one of his first and most significant books is a book called Policing the Crisis, which is called Mugging the State and Law and Order. And what he's talking about in this is an expansion on the moral panic framework that Cohen first establishes. But he's looking at the way that young Black men were talked about in the media and blamed for this kind of like really inflated understanding of a crisis of muggings in London in the 1970s. So one of the ways that moral panics are important, and they're especially important to what Jack is talking about when he's understanding this idea of like the conspiracy panic, is that They don't just frame the idea of a crisis situation, whatever that might be, whether it's like the youth out of control or this perceived inflated idea about crime. They tend to produce different actors as well. Like the concept of a moral panic and the folk devils and the ways that these start to exist in the stories that get told in the media doesn't just, like I said, frame a crisis. They cast different roles in that crisis, right? So there are moral entrepreneurs. These are the people who are identifying that we're in a moral crisis, right? These become, and who have something to gain from building that story and also probably creating structures to quote unquote manage whatever the crisis is. There are the deviants themselves. Those are your folk devils. Those are the kids. Those are the rockers. Those are the muggers, right? They're the problem, the thing which is disrupting normal moral society. You have the media who is telling these stories with a particular frame on them. You have the authorities, which can be the police, right? Typically, not exclusively, but often, or the government and other spaces. There's a lot of kind of overlap between authorities and social control agencies, right? They take a lot of similar roles, and sometimes people, like different groups, exist in both. The general public, which is perceived as needing to be protected from the expansion of this deviance, and therefore legitimizing, right, the value of whatever social control agency or authorities are stepping in. There are experts and advocacy groups, people who study what's going on and can make recommendations for policy changes. How do we fight whatever this crisis is? And then you have the scapegoats, who are the people who are blamed for the existence of it. So there can be all sorts of different things. In the case of, for instance, like the mod rocker story, right? The scapegoats end up being like parents who are too permissive, or the breakdown of like churches and like culture at the time, or right, there's a number of different things that become the blame for how deviance is rising. And then you have social control agencies, and these can again be different things. They can be things like schools, they can be things like programs, they can also be sometimes also still the police or governmentality structures, right? And so this is what it is that Jack is trying to do with the frame of the conspiracy panic. It's not just that he wants to talk about what conspiracy theories are and what they're doing, but how we think and talk about them publicly and what that is doing, what that is producing for us. And again, in the introduction to this book that I didn't give you guys, but he's describing how he's understanding conspiracy theories. He says, the conspiracy theory functions as an intolerable line and an antagonism. While occasionally linked to particular groups, the panic is actually over a particular form of thought and its potential for action. The scapegoating of conspiracy theories provides the conditions for social integration and political rationality. Conspiracy panics help to define the normal modes of dissent. Okay, that's a lot to take in. What that means is that the idea of conspiracy theories as a threat, especially as they might be connected to particular actions, justifies and necessitates those groups that we talked about in the previous slide, like control agencies, like authorities, like certain kinds of experts and advocacy groups and moral entrepreneurs, to reframe what is considered normal and safe and correct ways of resisting, of talking about politics, of dissenting from the norm. It regulates normativity, right, is what he's trying to say here in all of these different ways. And we'll say a little bit more about what kind. So on page 165 that you did have to read, he says, conspiracy panics, like the moral panics they resemble, have concrete effects. They produce legislation, in this case he's talking about on hate speech, material constraints on internet usage, investigations into academics and others who quote unquote traffic in conspiracy accounts, a proposed reconfiguration of professional journalism, as well as its actual reconfiguration as it went digital, right? So he's talking about this impact on what happened to journalism, which we talked about a couple weeks ago. As part of the broader movement to revitalize civil society, conspiracy panics inform the material constitution of the quote unquote we, capital We, that underpins institutional practices done in the name of community or public. Conspiracy panics also inform foreign policy as a component of global war on extremist ideologies. This is written very much in the wake of the framing of the war on terror. And that's just something to keep in mind, as well as the justification for surveillance at home. And this talks about some of the things we thought about when we were looking at our week with Sophia Noble, and dissent management in the homeland. They contribute to the promotion of certain kinds of investigative practices over others, distinguishing professional from amateur inquiries. In other words, reestablishing the idea of what is good in real research, what is good in real fact checking versus what is amateur, is not connected to institutions of stability like universities and things like that, right? Conspiracy panics anchor the proliferation of civilian watchdog groups, think tanks, and private intelligence agencies. So those are your moral entrepreneurs and your experts and advocacy groups coming in. So he's talking about all of these different ways that because we see conspiracies as a threat to the stability of the system, to like the faith in institutions, to the idea that we can trust what is told to us. Because we see this kind of rising populism, which he talks about too, right? As a suspiciousness, a collective suspiciousness of established institutions, that the conspiracy panic works to reestablish the idea of the importance of institutions, of recognized formal institutions, in order to control the potential risk coming from conspiracy theorists, right? And this definitely has a lot of real implications for us. I want to point out that when we talk about panics, we were talking about, because I do a little bit of work on this myself, when we talk about moral panics, when we talk about, in Jack's case, conspiracy panics, we're not saying that, in this case in particular, that there aren't potential issues to be addressed socially, right? That there isn't something happening that deserves some attention, right? But that the way that it's being constructed in the media, the way that characters are being cast, is benefiting a very particular worldview and is done for a particular end, right? It has specific political implications. Again, it doesn't mean, as we're going to talk about certain conspiracy groups coming up, that they don't pose real threats in some ways, right? It's more that what is also happening simultaneously in the like reestablishment of normative political thinking. This is a lot to take in this week, I know. So I hope that is helpful. So keeping all of that in mind from Jack's work, we're going to look now at QAnon, the QAnon conspiracy and how people talk about it through our second reading by Alice Marwick and William Clyde Parton. And so this is looking at how alternative facts are constructed and how we're going to think about and read something like the QAnon conspiracy and its links to the kind of populism that Jack is also outlining as a rising threat to civil society. Alice Marwick, who is the lead on this text, is the associate professor and co-director at the Center for Information Technology and Public Life at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, which unfortunately recently faced an active shooter situation. But the school itself is known primarily for its journalism and media department, another very good public school, much like Rutgers, right? So that means those are state schools. She's also the author of Status Update, Celebrity Publicity and Branding in the Social Media Age. And some of this kind of came out of her work, of her dissertation at NYU in the Media and Culture and Communications department. So the article really draws on some earlier work that Mara did on socio-technical models and media effects as what happens with how we are using and engaging media, right? If we go back to some of our thinking on looking at either the political economy, which looks at the generation of media and what it's intending to do and who's creating it, versus cultural studies models of what's happening with how people are engaging it. Media effects is also more sort of user end focused, right? And her framework encourages researchers to think holistically about the complex interrelationships between audiences' own meaning-making practices. So that means like, how do we make our meanings? How do we think about things? Online content and the social affordances of digital media, as well as using multiple methodologies in order to analyze these empirical phenomena. And what she's really doing here is building on media effects and audience research, in particular, a subfield of media studies, and looking at the affordances of digital media in particular. So that's how we're starting to approach this text together that she's written. So she says there's no real conspiracy type or personality. I think this is something that's really important for her to be addressing and looking at, because we're looking at media effects and meaning making and digital affordances. She's really taking us out of, I think, what very often happens in the way that we publicly talk about conspiracies and conspiracy theories in the media, right? As part of that conspiracy panic mindset, we tend to talk about them in terms of social psychologies, right? So people who are doing social psychology research, which looks to pathologize a trend and find certain kinds of personalities that are more susceptible to it than others. And so that's what she's trying to refute here. She says there is no conspiracy theorist type or personality. There's no particular kind of person that is automatically a conspiracy theorist like subject or is more likely to become one, but that they become conspiracy theorists because they're exposed to a community of other people who are engaging in this process of meaning making. And we'll get into this more. This brings us back into our conversations about what's happening in participatory culture models. So it's actually through interactions to the dialogue that they become conspiratorial. So people do this in a kind of collective space is what she's trying to say here, that we are in, to some extent, our beliefs, our meaning-making processes happen in collective spaces. So if you happen to be in a context of a lot of people thinking in a particular way, it's a lot easier for you to also start thinking in a particular way. And that can happen in what your immediate communities in IRL are, or it can happen in how you are seeing things in different kinds of digital affordance spaces. What Marwick and Part N do is they do this really big deep dive on what's happening on some of the sites where QAnon bakers or anons are posting and talking to each other about what's happening, and they do a qualitative research analysis of those communications. And according to her, she says that there's a participatory culture, right? Participatory nature of online spaces more generally. And right, we've talked about this all semester. This is what you guys are investigating in your sites. And that there are ways of sharing and producing knowledge outside of elite institutions, right? Which Jenkins also talks about. That there's this kind of way that people collaborate in knowledge building, and that this makes for particularly interesting spaces, and people are primed, she says, by this kind of structure for conspiratorial thinking because they're already thinking in these kind of outside of elite institutions, populist spaces that are also participatory, and everyone is encouraged and valued. If we think back to some of the things Jenkins said, you are perceived to be valued and valid in these spaces for your contributions, even if you are not an expert. And so she says that kind of aspect of participatory culture just makes the growth of conspiracy models more likely. And so one of their final conclusions, as they're thinking about whether conspiracy theory spaces constitute a form of participatory culture, and they say here very clearly, it's our view that QAnon is not a corruption of participatory culture, but instead exemplifies its tenets as originally documented by Jenkins. So this goes back to our first person, week one, Christoph Fuchs, who is critiquing Jenkins and Jenkins' assertion that participatory culture spaces are naturally expected to be democratic, progressive spaces, right? Because what they're saying here is there's nothing that this is participatory culture, and what it's producing is decidedly not like progressive democracy, right? It's producing something else. And so that's deeply foundational, and that it's not a corruption, but of what happens in participatory culture spaces and diffuse knowledge building models without checks, without institutional models of fact checking or any of those things. So this will link back and connect to the podcast I gave you guys to listen to this week. So this is the Pizzagate situation, which some of you may have memory of. I know it was a while ago, but this was a social media phenomenon. It started on Facebook. That podcast episode I gave you talked about its relationship to Facebook and the woman who actually got it started. But it had very real world implications for people. In case you haven't yet listened to the controversy is that there's this false theory that Hillary Clinton and potentially other members of the Democratic Party were operating a child sex trafficking ring out of the basement of a Comet Ping Pong Pizza in DC. This is actually in Chevy Chase. I used to live down the road from it. And this existed all over 4chan boards and was like really widely circulated. And the owners were repeatedly harassed, sent death threats. And eventually this culminated in a man walking into the restaurant in 2016 with a semi-automatic rifle. And he fired 3 rounds into the building before he was arrested, but thankfully no one was hurt or killed. But he was looking for the basement door, right? And if you listen to that podcast, this is the whole narrative, right? Is that all of this is happening is underneath the Comet Pizza, and there's all these code ideas about what people are ordering. And because this is in a very wealthy, often populated by people who work in government area of DC. And the expectation there is that what's happened. So what they're assuming is that the people who are purchasing pizzas who are part of this, actually just part of the normal customers, right, of the pizza parlor are in fact actually participating in some kind of sex trafficking ring out of the basement. And that's all coded in the way that they're ordering their pizza. This is all in the podcast. So I really encourage you guys to listen to it if you haven't yet. So how does Pizzagate connect to QAnon, right? So what Mark and Clyde are investigating, and they say that QAnon, it really picks up from Pizzagate. Pizzagate is the sort of originating narrative. And following that, an anonymous poster on 4chan, known only as Q, claimed that the elite within the Democratic Party, again, so people that might be likely to be living in the same area, Chevy Chase, was actually a satanic sex trafficking and baby eating cult. And that they took this thread of the original story of Pizzagate and expanded on it to make it even more grotesque and alarmist, right? They added baby eating. And this anonymous poster claimed that there were good people in the government that were working to try to expose this Democratic cabal and throw them all in prison. And this is what was termed the storm, right? And all through these very intense cryptic analyses of uncryptable terms and language, right? Anything could be turned into something that could be analyzed as if it was coded, much like people's pizza orders, right? And no one was ever really clear what the quote unquote storm was going to be, but Q would just give these little bits of information or leaks, as they were referred to, or drops, supposedly from government sources that he was close to. And it was like a puzzle that people played together in a way, right? It's like people would like stay on like the 4chans and keep a track of everything as like new things were coming out. And this was like the language of what was happening for a lot of people in this kind of subculture at the time. So they show us the first of these Q drops that was from 6 years ago on October 28th and written in a way that's meant to almost like evoke what a lot of baby boomers would recognize from their experiences of like old war movies and spy films of like a telegraph style of communication where you speak in short sentences and things are very like, think they use words like mockingbird and what is supposed to feel like code or encrypted information, because the idea is that it's to protect the information from the visibility of like eyes that are not supposed to see it. But at the same time, this is like super publicly visible. But it's playing at all of these kinds of models of CIA or secret police or secret military operations models that, again, would be very familiar to a specific generation and also their kids, right? From a particular era of cinema. And they've cast a bunch of characters in this. If we go back to our thinking about conspiracy panics and moral panics, right? The fascinating thing about this is that this is a conspiracy theory. QAnon's frame and arguably Pizzagate are conspiracy theories that are based on a framework of a moral panic, where they have decided that there is a satanic threat inside the Democratic government and they're producing a moral panic. And so then that kind of widens what happens in a moral panic, right? So he talked about how moral panics that are created by the traditional media have this reifying or reproducing effect of what's going on in society and civil society. And so they reestablish the importance of certain kinds of formal institutions. And they are very much invested in like reestablishing social norms. So that means reinforcing the police, reinforcing education institutions, reinforcing structures of normativity. But what kind of happens in the context of the QAnon production of a moral panic inside of this other kind of media space is that the people who are witnessing this perceive themselves to be the necessary actor, responders, and also the general public in this narrative, and that they become activated in performing some of those roles of social control agencies or whatever else, which tend to be in a traditional moral panic, very specifically designated people in society, right? The bakers is what they get called, right? This is what they're called in the article by Marwick and Parton, are QAnon believers who are working to interpret quote unquote crumbs of information. So they become kind of experts of decryption for Q posts in order to like create insights or bread, right? So they can make the messages for the people who are like less indoctrinated, less expert in this area to be able to understand. This is the way that they're framing what's happening in this participatory culture. Right. So one of the things that they push against is a kind of idea that you'll also see Jack talks about, that populism is inherently anti-expertise. They say that instead, what we want is to complicate the notion that populism is inherently anti-expertise. Instead, we ask, whose expertise matters and how expertise is defined. Because what they're finding is that there's actually a lot of investment in expertise. They understand that QAnon, quote unquote, researchers interpreting these drops are engaged in this kind of populist expertise building, which I just mentioned, and that these drops create, quote unquote, alternative facts through a series of proofs. And those proofs are the way that they're demonstrating the information in front of them. This is also a bread reference, by the way, for anyone who bakes. And so they liken this to reading scripture, that this kind of way that people are reading 4chan, 8chan boards has some similar characteristics to it. And that there's a sense that there are people who are true believers and that these texts are delivering important information to those true believers. And that also you are supposed to be suspicious of non-believers if you are part of this group of the believers, of the kind of included. And also that there's a sense that there's a threat of persecution from the outside because the people who are outside simply don't understand and don't engage in your scripture. So there's a framing that kind of is consistent in that way. So according to Marwick and Clyde, this is very similar to fan fiction models. And they talk about this example of the television show Twin Peaks and the fan fiction that grew up around it on a site called Usenet, which was an early internet board predating 4chan. And Jenkins did work on this phenomenon and argued that the combination of a mystery like narrative in the show and the internet community of participatory culture created a scriptural culture, right? People would get on this board after a new episode and try to decode what had happened. And you had people who were obviously really committed, knew all of the different kinds of twists and turns in the plot, could reference things back from previous episodes, and were trying to establish what they thought might be happening. And he says this is centered on circulation and interpretation as a scriptural culture. If any of you have ever been part of a fan community, some of you have written about them, I know already in this semester, you'll understand that there's this kind of reinforcing logic that happens where one fan says something and another one builds on it. And then there are other tapestries of stories that get created, right? And so there's a lot of things that are happening in those spaces where there's like a decoding of what's in the original script, but then there's also writing happening on top of it, right? There's the production of different kinds of stories on top of an investigative relationship to what was already in the original text. And that's a lot of what they're saying is also happening in the way that people were negotiating Q. That so there were the drops themselves, but that a lot of what really created the mythos of QAnon was not necessarily what was in them, but the way that people were writing around them in this participatory culture of how they were quote unquote interpreting, but then also adding on to, right? And this is just here because who killed Laura Palmer? Who is Q? There's a lot of fascination and a lot of questioning about who this person was. And I think the point that's trying to be made here is that while there is obviously an originating force in this, it's also very much a participatory culture event and is not exclusively about an original author. And that's part of what makes it so deeply representative in many ways, troublingly, obviously, of what happens in these kinds of digital culture spaces and what participatory culture can do. And so as a result of this kind of scriptural modality and also this kind of collective meaning making happening in the participatory culture of QAnon pages, they argue that this is what led to the Capitol insurrection on January 6th, which was framed for many people who were part of this participatory culture as the storm, right? They start with this narrative at the very beginning of the first Q drop. And so from that position, there's always been this like end point of a cataclysmic action that's supposed to be transformative. And all of these people who got very invested in participating in QAnon, a lot of people ended up casting themselves in it. And again, they've already established themselves in that narrative as like doing a good thing, which is why I think so many people who participated in this refused to understand like what it was that they were actually doing, the kind of violence of this activity and what ended up happening. And the people who like very clearly seemed surprised that they were being arrested, even while they were threatening the lives of people in the Senate and also threatening police, there was still this supposition that based on the narrative they were inside of, they were doing the right thing. It's a very complicated, messy, upsetting moment in American history. And so I added a couple of pieces for you guys to look at. You are absolutely not obligated to talk about these, but if any of you do read them and want to talk about them in this week's discussion post, I would really like to hear what those of you who have any relationship to gaming or gamification models have to say about this idea, because I think that it's a fascinating way of thinking about that. It's not just a question of participatory culture, but it is the quote unquote gamification of propaganda, right? What that means is that typically we experience propaganda. If we go back to our conversation about political economy versus cultural studies, propaganda is really imagined as a top-down construction that's fed to us. And then we respond to it in various ways. Either we accept it or we resist it or we half accept it or whatever. But like we are engaging with it as something delivered to us from a specific place and a specific voice. Versus what they're saying is happening here in the gamification of propaganda, meaning that you are rewarded with these little crumbs and the sense of being the person who understood something to pass this stuff around, right? To be part of the generation and dissemination of that propaganda, right? Bakers were, again, not just, as much as they might have thought of themselves as decoding something that was already there, they were writing new stories as part of the process of participating. And so that propaganda, that like anti-governmental propaganda, was happening in a very diffuse way, in a networked public way. And there are so many things we can think about, whether it's ZZ Papakarisi's ideas about networked publics, or the way that we talked about role playing and identity building. And certainly a lot of this has been likened to, these articles are likening it to reality games, to ARGs, and other people have likened it to LARPing, to live action role playing because of the actual event. And there's a lot of different ways of different theories that we've looked at throughout this semester that we could maybe understand some of what's happening in these kinds of spaces. And I'm so curious what you guys think about this, about the idea of gamification of propaganda, or of how alternate reality or augmented reality ideas about culture and society are altering the way that we think about the political world that we live in. And as young folks, I just want to know what you guys are thinking about all of that. And let me know what you thought of the readings this week. And I really look forward to hearing from you guys. I'm sorry this one's a little late. Take it easy.